I think there are two stories happening right now. I think there's one story happening in which people who feel threatened, particularly on on the political left, are frustrated, annoyed, angry with people in the administration who are destroying Tesla supercharging stations, protesting, etc. So there's like that message. But like there's this other thing that's really important that feels like it's happening that is underreported. If you watch the All In Pod has interviews with Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent, and I think as two really important cabinet members, like what they're trying to achieve and how. And I think there's like this really important story of building American financial integrity that's happening. And I think it's underreported, and I think people don't really understand it and we've been so conditioned to be emotionally reactive to the news of the day. And I think if we find a way to like just take all of these components in perspective and realize that if these projects work, we're going to be in such a great financial position that the US will be much stronger as a country in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. And yes, that comes
Hey everyone, welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we're talking changes in AI, among other things. Lakshya, Shashi, a lot's been happening in the world of AI. I kind of want to return at first to a bit of an old idea that's been getting some recent attention. There's a Kai-Fu Lee video kind of circulating, and with specific regard to data and data being the lifeblood of these AI systems. I think in that video, he's quoted as some paraphrase of saying, data is to AI as oxygen is to humans. And I'm just curious to kind of get your two downloads on kind of what that means, maybe the parts that we agree or disagree with. Shashi, why don't we start with you?
Kai-Fu Lee makes a statement about open source. So the core of his idea is that open source model training is an order of magnitude more efficient than what companies like OpenAI and Anthropic are doing. So the question that he's raising is building a closed model like OpenAI, misnomer, and Anthropic, does it make sense financially for those investors to to fund loss making for a very large closed model when training of an open source model is much, much more efficient. Yeah, I would just amend his statement to say that those open source models are only possible because of the huge investments that the closed models have made, and therefore you can create the kind of training data that makes it more efficient for the open source models to take shortcuts. So that yes, that the steps exist, but on a going forward basis, tell me how you think about this, gentlemen. Is it a wise investment to continue to put money into an OpenAI or an Anthropic when these open source models are really good? And does that last 1% or 5% really matter at this stage?
My individual take is that one, I think synthetic data has gotten OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on like pretty far. Like they're able to feed their own models and evolve them by quite a bit. And so in the unsupervised learning space, so that being like you haven't like labeled and manually like put like flags on your training data that tells your model like what's a good outcome and what's a bad outcome. OpenAI continues to make a decent amount of progress. So we've seen like again, GPT-3 was like a big change moment that kind of showed to the world like what's possible. GPT-4 came out, we saw improvements. GPT-4.5 came out, people can't really tell the difference. So it does feel like unsupervised learning, we're reaching a limit. And I think that's a part of that statement you just made, Shashi, where we're seeing that these open source models are possible because these big closed source models are able to generate synthetic data that's very likely are diffusing down into the open source models, right? The synthetic data that we need to create really good open source unsupervised models is now out there and kind of available for the world simply because these products exist. I think when we talk about supervised, so we've seen a really big jump in regards to reasoning models, right? And the planned and intuitive steps that a lot of them take. That one's a little bit more unclear to me. I think that one is a case where maybe it makes sense to keep investing and keep on assuming that ends up being the path forward. But at the same time, I think you could very easily make an argument that's not. And all of a sudden, like these big, gigantic training like regimes and routines that these gigantic companies have is all of a sudden like not as significantly valuable as it's being chalked up to be. Open conversation. I even sitting here, I don't have like a solid take on that, but I recognize like I could spin that argument both ways really easily.
I think for me, I think I agree completely with what you said in that the frontier is probably always going to be done by whomever decides that they're going to throw the most money. at this problem, at least for the foreseeable future. And then the open source models will kind of lag behind, so to speak, of those. And so I think for at least one company, there will always be some intrinsic value of kind of being on the frontier, whatever kind of that frontier means. And for, what fraction of use cases that is most important, to your point, is it 0.1%? Is it 1%? Is it 10%? I'm not exactly sure. I think the bet to me kind of breaks down for those large model provider companies as to how you categorize them. If you do, in fact, categorize them as purely model provider companies, I think that's a much more bear style case than if you assume these companies are both model providers and application developers. And whatever that application developer kind of becomes in this new world of AI, I think that those companies that hope to both train the frontier models and have some sort of profitability or at least some substantial revenue have to be both model providers and application providers. I think the one kind of curveball to this is something that we've talked about before, which is specifically for the model providers of Google and or XAI. Both of those platforms have unique data sources, kind of bringing this conversation circular back to this lifeblood of AI conversation that make those two positions relatively unique. So to me, those two companies almost fall in a different bucket than OpenAI and Anthropic, maybe Mistral or something else. And so to me, you kind of have Google and XAI. They're going to be model providers. They obviously have applications and they have unique streams of data. You have OpenAI and Anthropic, who are primarily model providers, but they don't really have any unique source of data. Therefore, they're incentivized to remain leaders in innovation techniques, etc. And you have Meta and others who are going to continue to leverage the open source community, realizing their underlying intelligence is probably going to be slightly lagging behind, but ultimately might be good enough for the bulk of use cases they hope to ultimately serve.
Let's lay out the players in the game. So the American position has been to win the race for the best models. And in taking that position, the counter position that China has taken is to evaporate the value of the large language models. So looking at the bottom of this tech stack, as an investor, what I believe in is the bottom of that stack, the data centers, the power, the cooling, and the chips. NVIDIA is one of my biggest holdings. I believe in the bottom of that stack. Above that, at the large language model level, this is where it is still very nebulous. A lot is going to change over the next 5 years. Kai-Fu Lee's position, as he articulates it here, if you extrapolate that out, it would imply that OpenAI doesn't make it. It would imply that Anthropic doesn't make it. And the providers are the Llama, the DeepSeek, the open source kind of flavors of large language models that continue to thrive. And the Chinese position in this has been, if the Americans want to win this in a proprietary way, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to diffuse that by making really great models completely free and open source. So
Mm-hmm.
those are two of the players in the game. Now let's go to Anthropic. So Anthropic is a really interesting study of the big tech players in that Anthropic has raised a lot of money from Google and Amazon in particular. So those are two of the largest shareholders of Anthropic. Google has put money into Gemini, but has not gained market traction. So their market traction is very low. I believe it's sub 1% of uses of large language models, despite them investing heavily in getting the founders re-engaged, et cetera. So Google is not winning this, and I think they, at some level, know they won't be winning. If there is value accreted to the large language model, it will not go to Google, and I think they know that at some level now. So they're investing in Anthropic as a potential winner that they would share in the upside in. Amazon has not really invested in the space, I think wisely. I would actually say Jassie's position in this has been really smart to not pour a bunch of money into building their own large language models at a massive, at a massive scale. Of course, they're going to build some at a smaller scale, but in terms of pouring real dollars there, I think it's a smart approach not to, and to let this whole thing play out. But Amazon has been a significant investor in Anthropic. I think Anthropic has found a niche with software engineering, which is, as we said before, one of the few niches where large language models have proven demonstrable value
Mm-hmm.
and efficiency that has gotten all the way to production. Whereas just about everywhere else in the main, it has not yet done that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Anthropic has a lane there, and should they focus on that software engineering lane, they can realize some value that is beyond beyond what currently you would use a DeepSeek for example. But that's where that last 5 to 10% actually makes a difference. And people, because customers will be willing to pay for that last 5 to 10% of quality of output from a closed model. OpenAI has raised a lot of money. Let me just pull up the numbers here. Okay, so their last raise was 40 billion at a 340 billion valuation. $340 billion is a huge valuation for a private company.
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point, they have secondaries that their employees can sell shares. And this is again a company born as a nonprofit to be valued at 340 billion in for-profit shares is a lot. So where does that leave us? I think it generally leaves us in a space where there are only niches available to true large language model providers. Anthropic has one potential niche. Google has no niche.
Mm-hmm.
OpenAI is trying to find its niche still. And OpenAI is the biggest gamble, pro or con, in this space. You could have the winner take all AGI come out of OpenAI, or you could have it all go to zero. And I think there's significant odds on both of those.
I do think so in that whole analysis, the one thing I will say is that like I think everything at the same layer or above the model provider, like most of these app companies that have like really widespread, they got involved in the model at some point. Every single one of them has become like a very multi-headed company, right? The way that they try to grab market share is so multi-dimensional now, whereas what I would assume like companies that are like traditionally like ZERP era, like you focus on one like big lane, like you have one really strong channel, you just amplify that. We're seeing everybody see like, wait, people really want to search API. Perplexity launches one with their own model. OpenAI launches one with their own model. Oh, we have a lot of software developer love. Can we release a UI that's focused on software developers? Oh, people are using it for writing. Let's release a writing UI. And we're seeing I think we're kind of seeing like, it's almost like it's like their typical startup trying to find product market fit. Obviously they're dancing with a lot of money, but I think single one of them is looking for like, what is the market where they can stick? It's no longer about like their model being valuable. It's about, we have an application or we have a use case or we have a way in which the product is highly, highly loved that cannot be touched. ChatGPT is one of those, for the record. It obviously just has to operate like a gigantic loss for what that product is. And it's unclear to me, especially as a developer these days, it's become so favorable to see an OpenAI announcement and them trying to get me on a closed source model in said announcement to use their tool. And all of a sudden be like, why would I do that? Let me just use the Anthropic equivalent for that thing, right? We have still seen that there are some places that people haven't really touched. We've always kind of talked about AI in the last couple of months as just like a textual thing, but voice models are emerging. We're seeing video models emerging. Those haven't really entered developer hands. So there is still some greenfield. As to how much that actually ends up making a difference or actually quote unquote getting to prod, we have yet to see. Like that's completely untouched. But there are a lot of open blue oceans that haven't yet had market challengers or competition really for them.
Let's say there are three teams. I want to know who you would bet on. There are three teams on the field. There's OpenAI flying solo.
Mm-hmm.
There is Anthropic is the second team, and they're flying with Amazon and Google.
Mm-hmm.
And the third team is NVIDIA and Perplexity. And I say that because one of Perplexity's biggest funders is NVIDIA.
Mm-hmm.
So NVIDIA and Jeff Bezos personally are two of the biggest funding providers to Perplexity. If you had to look at those three teams and pick one of them that you think is going to be best positioned in 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
who would you bet on?
For me, I say this generally as someone who's not long on Perplexity, but I say this because you package them with NVIDIA. And two, I think in all this space of like this like market grab and product market fit hunt, they've proven to be like, assuming relatively small team relative to Anthropic and OpenAI, they can move pretty quick. And so assuming they keep the adjustment rate up and the constant like seeking of like what their market fit is, I assume they would survive pretty okay in 5 years, not with the product they have now, but with some hypothetical product that hasn't yet been imagined. And you package them with NVIDIA, so that's a big portion of my vote. With OpenAI, I think increasingly, I used to be like quite long on OpenAI because like, again, the typical person who's not in the tech sphere, AI means ChatGPT to them. Those two words are the same thing, right? At the moment, they are winning the app layer, right? The problem is that app layer runs at such a heavy cost that maybe it could run at low cost in perpetuity, and maybe that data is just so valuable. but that's an unknown. At least as a developer, OpenAI is going down. Like I'm more bearish on OpenAI as a developer ecosystem because they force me to closed source systems when I know the open source systems are now much more capable, right? So like OpenAI, like from one way I put them up there because again, like we exist. I was born and raised in an era where like having users was all that really mattered, and everything else operated at a cost, and you just accepted that like you're never going to hit profitability. Just keep taking money, serve the users and the growth that you have. But this is a very expensive time. It's a very expensive set of apps to run, which forces that perspective to lean a little bit more to what Anthropic is, where their developer love is so high that I assume would form most of their market share in the longer term.
Yeah, for me, I would make the bull case for OpenAI of the three buckets that you outlined. I think, like Lakshay said, they're winning consumer right now. That will matter, or it won't. I'm not exactly sure if it will. I also agree with him that at the developer community, to me, at least in my limited exposure, seems to be gravitating towards Anthropic. Both of those are cases against OpenAI. All that said, the one thing that I can't let go of for OpenAI is the brain trust that I believe exists within that organization that allows them to be kind of constantly on the frontier, constantly breaking ground. And so if someone is going to achieve AGI out of those three companies, I would bet on that being OpenAI. In addition
Yeah,
to that,
I would say the same thing.
I also see OpenAI as being of those three, maybe Perplexity with the combination of NVIDIA just because of NVIDIA, but of those three, OpenAI being the most important for US national security in winning the frontier of AI intelligence or superintelligence. And because of that, even if the consumer products can't prop them up over the next, call it 5 to 10 years, I think there will be a national dependency on making sure they remain, again, kind of at the bleeding edge, if you will. And so all those kind of, that nexus of factors, if you will, makes me overall bullish on AI. That said, I would actually argue that all three are going to exist in 5 years. I don't see any of
Mhm.
those three going to zero.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so existing, I could see all three existing. In terms of likely winner among those three candidates, I actually think NVIDIA is going to win the
Can I
large
ask a
language
question
model.
real fast?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think you're asking maybe two different questions inside of one, and I think my answer might also depend on pulling these apart. Because an investment in present day of OpenAI and
Hmm.
where it's going to be in 5 years, in my opinion, probably has a smaller delta than both of the other two. So if you're
Yeah.
gauging like where would your dollar best be spent in investing in the current company right now to realize maximum return in 5 years, I think I would change my answer. But that's only because right now
Yeah.
I kind of deem the valuation of OpenAI to be inflated.
Yeah. My feeling is that NVIDIA is going to win the large language model layer. And I believe that because they can vertically integrate. They've got the physics engines, their Cosmos engine. Maybe this is maybe a good time to transition to the NVIDIA announcement. NVIDIA just announced a partnership with Disney. They had a really interesting demo where Jensen showed off a robot. I don't know if you can screen share that, but it's an adorable little robot based on NVIDIA's physics engine. I think the large language model market is still so nebulous. We're still in such early days of this market that um, I don't think we're yet in the place where it has consolidated to the point where you can forecast who will be in the game, let alone winning the game at a certain number of years out. And so I would argue that NVIDIA has just as good of a chance of winning that. And the barbell strategy. So when we started this podcast a year ago or some time ago, we talked about this barbell strategy of investing, where you invest in the very bottom of the stack, the power, the cooling, the wiring, and the
Mm-hmm.
chips that go into data centers. And then on the other end, the app layer, where the apps generate end user value and build audience. And
Mm-hmm.
this strategy that Jensen's using is exactly that barbell strategy. He's
Mm-hmm.
winning on the chips, and if he's investing on the front end where Perplexity's building audience cheaply relative to OpenAI, right? So the per use cost for Perplexity is way, way cheaper than it is
Mm-hmm.
for OpenAI because OpenAI burns so much money on pre-training and developing these very, very large frontier models. It's actually a brilliant strategy, and let's just say Perplexity gets bought by NVIDIA 2 years from now.
Mm.
And you could argue that NVIDIA is sort of laying the groundwork for something like that,
Yeah.
where Perplexity is building this front end audience, and NVIDIA's got all the back end kind of horsepower.
Yeah.
It sort of perfectly aligns with the Kai-Fu Lee argument where we started this conversation, in that Kai-Fu Lee is saying there's no value in that middle layer. right? There's not going to be anything there, and so it's all going to evaporate. And then so Jensen's strategy is actually highly aligned with that.
I guess out of curiosity, so like I say this as someone who like has never asked this question before or like even like thought about it truly. Research lab companies existed, right? OpenAI has obviously become like an app company. They've become a developer company. They've become all sorts of things. But like what is the economic upside and how do you like actually reach a gigantic valuation if you were to assume like you are a research lab first? Right? Like what is that playbook typically?
The most famous example I know of is Bell Labs, which was kind of a subsidiary of AT&T historically, but that was a unique case in that AT&T had a government kind of induced monopoly, and so
Mm,
the research lab that was kind of Bell Labs was able to operate as a loss leader.
yeah.
The other companies that have like successfully had internal incubators that I'm aware of are like DuPont and Intuit, believe it or not. Like the TurboTax product was like completely incubated in-house, and like DuPont made like Teflon, nonstick, all the,
Yeah.
unfortunate health side effect of that aside, but just like they were like able to innovate holistically. Like the best research lab of all time, arguably, is Bell Labs, which was
Yeah.
born inside of, what is now AT&T and what was it then, Southwestern Bell and other companies.
Yeah, it's just I don't
Hmm.
know. Like it's hard for me to say like Shashi like the overall statement you made about like the barbell strategy and like what that means for perplexing NVIDIA like that's a thesis I agree with, but I kind of like as Damon kind of alluded to, I would bet on OpenAI to figure out like if AGI happens, my bet is that an OpenAI does that out of everyone. So the question is
Hey,
like how does that value materialize into like a stakeholder?
can I ask a maybe thought provoking question that I don't think I agree with, but just want to open it for sake of discussion? What if we agree on the barbell structure, but rather than drawing the second barbell at the app layer, it actually exists at the large language model layer or the model layer? Meaning, like, if all of a sudden AGI is the product, that's the other pole of the dumbbell.
It's hard to see how that ends up being the whole picture, right? The barbell means audience on one end and the horsepower on the other end, right? And middleware typically doesn't carry a lot of value. If you just kind of go back to companies that offer middleware layers, they typically aren't able to accrue a lot of the value. So where does value accrue? Value accrues to either building a great brand at the end user level and deeply understanding the nuance of how the end user works, or the very ground level kind of engine horsepower being able to produce atoms. And so I don't see how let's just say there was AGI today. Like let's just go through this hypothetical. There's
Yeah.
AGI today. It only exists in one place, and that's in OpenAI as a company.
Mhm.
They still can't, like most humans, you walk down the street, you go to like, go through your neighborhood or to a restaurant, like most of those people in there aren't going to be proficient prompters of ChatGPT as it is today. They aren't going to they aren't going to be capable of even leveraging the power of an AGI without some kind of end user based tooling that makes it very simple for them to do their accounting or do their legal work or do their medical work or whatever it is. Like they still need end user interfaces that make that very easy spoon fed for them.
Yeah,
To
again, I,
me,
I don't honestly disagree. Go ahead, Lakshya.
I would like, I mean, I would move the goal a little bit. Like in my head, like if everyone had a Jarvis and all you do is like, hey, like, can you just like take care of my like meeting with my doctor today and like put that together? Like right now, prompting is like, it's kind of an art, kind of ish,
Hmm.
something that you have to like get used to doing. But I would assume that like in a world that like AGI exists, like you talk to it like a human and that human gets things done 100% of the time is like what AGI is as like a really loose, like kind of spontaneous definition. Right? And like in that world, like let's say OpenAI exists in WhatsApp, they exist as a phone number you can call, they exist as a Siri extension, all that sort of stuff. At that level, if OpenAI has like the singular like voice command point or the singular text box that exists on your phone, whatever it may be, then the app layer moves all of a sudden, right? The app layer is like still ChatGPT, just in a format that's like better than back and forth with an AI model. It's like, do this, thing happens. If we get there, I assume, and I would bet that OpenAI is the company that gets there, and the interface, whatever maybe like a partnership with Apple or an agreement with Google or whoever like the mobile provider of the time is, evolves to give them that sort of like natural plug and play with a gigantic company, that to me feels like indomitable and actually removes away the need for the consumer highly empathetically designed UI for the layperson at a bare minimum.
Practically, let's just say there is a 50-year-old accountant who's not super proficient in AI tools. How are they going to benefit once AGI is achieved? Practically, what do you see happening?
Like to me, like the sci-fi future, and mind you, this is all hypothetical. Like again, we're so far away from this, and even as people building the space, I still slam my head into a desk every time all these AI models like I can't do that. I literally gave it a thing to go do that exact thing. But in a version where this stuff like works as sort of like promised, almost like let's say you're this 50-year-old accountant, you have ChatGPT, and the two things that like you're used to is you have a ChatGPT tab and you have your work tab or something, right? And you're like, ChatGPT, take care of this accounting consulting job I have with XYZ company. Maybe computer operator goes off, runs off, does some work. Maybe the browser collects the data from wherever you need. Deep research is executing. Tool use is doing really, really well. Just dumps all of your data into the like interface that you're supposed to be serving, and you ship that off. Your client's job is done. In the sci-fi future, very, very far away, and these models suck at doing anything for that takes more than like 5 seconds right now. But in that universe, like if browser use, if taking over the app layer, like by means of computer usage becomes a thing, you don't need a specialized UI all the time. Most cases would be covered without a UI.
Yeah, I think the concise version of that is assume that the AGI can use a computer like a human, and then all the human has to do is communicate it what it wants done, either by text or verbally to it. And again, this is not necessarily the future that I think is most likely, or at least most likely in the next handful of years. But
Hmm.
the other kind of like paradigm flip I would serve back in the kind of dumbbell argument is looking at this market through the lens of not the traditional dumbbell like SaaS model, but rather maybe through the lens more analogous to like airlines or personal computers pre-Apple. And what I mean by that is like you could argue that personal computing and air travel are some of the most fundamentally powerful introductions of technology of the last 150 years, give or take. All that said, the companies that actually deliver that end product, except for Apple, have essentially gone to zero. They're basically break even at best. Right? All your airline companies operate a business model that's effectively break even, where all the value in that business, you could argue, is accrued to the quote unquote middleware of that market. And similar to computers, like gateway computers, as an example, Dell even don't have great businesses, even though they operate industry leading gateway at the time, industry leading businesses in one of the most important kind of industries in the world. And so I wonder also if AI is similar to that, in which the model value actually does go to zero, but you actually don't get any real app winners at all, which kind of would just argue for whatever a single whole version of a dumbbell is. So where like all the value is basically accrued at the, power and chip layer.
So let me just push on a couple of sides of that, Damon. If there's no actual end user value, then the bottom of the stack fails as well, right? Like you don't need chips and data centers if nobody's using it because it's uneconomic.
Not in the analogy for airlines because gas still works. Right? Someone's still paying for the gas to actually do the cross-continental or the intercontinental travel.
The middleware layer is software, and it's so highly scalable, and that we already have proof points of very good open source large language models. The app layer almost certainly is beneficial if you can just find an audience. One of the videos we shared is about this high schooler this week. Like this high schooler 10 months ago created this like calorie tracking app and is making like 20 million ARR on like this. This is a very simple like app layer play. Finds an audience, finds something that LLMs are sort of good at, like not great at, but sort of good at, and good enough to find a market fit and sell a subscription, right? So like there's just going to be lots of those kinds of things where you get specific enough about a niche that is interested in paying for a pretty good solution, an imperfect but pretty good solution, and you sell it. And people are just going to keep doing that. And that's going to create that funnel where even if the middle layer is an open source layer, I'm guessing they're building on OpenAI's API right now, but that's every app layer company can switch models. That's trivially easy.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, you can go all the way down to the hardware. The hardware will work. If the middle layer is still free or something approximating free, then the app layer is just about audience. And this gets back to what Lakshya was saying. Like it's back to the distribution game as the only game to play.
Yeah, I don't disagree. For the record, again, I don't disagree with any of that. I just think the question fundamentally becomes maybe even more simply said, what is the interface? So long as the interface remains in the traditional interface forms that we recognize them today, I think the dumbbell argument's a very solid one. I think the only thing that disrupts it significantly is if all of a sudden you have to reimagine the dumbbell argument. And again, not arguing for that future, just
I think meta glasses or a new version of the Humane Pin. Humane Pin cute idea timed poorly, I think. It's just too early
Hmm.
for that to work. But perhaps another version of that that's funded at the right time, 2 years from now, where, like let's just make up a company. Like let's just say you have a company called Button. And you just have a little button and you push it and you talk to it, and
Hmm.
it does all the Jarvis stuff you just talked about, Lakshya.
Hmm.
And it has computer use and maybe has access to your PC or your laptop. And
Yeah.
it's just doing all this stuff for you,
Hmm.
just a user on your computer so that you can be out on a trail somewhere and
Yeah.
just, hitting the button.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. I think like we're feeling like with computer use, I think the expansion of what's possible has like jumped by quite a bit. And again, no one I don't think really anyone's using computer use in a prod setting. That has not happened. And I don't think we've seen one company be like, computer use is how we solved XYZ problem. That has not been a sentence that's been said yet, right? But in the hypothetical world where that does exist, the interface can change, right? The interface doesn't need to be my hands are on a keyboard. The interface can suddenly be like my voice into a microphone. It can suddenly be like, if you want to go as like super, super far-fetched as you want, like neural interfaces exist. There are all sorts of things that you can pull off as like, I don't need to type a response into a computer. Right now, I'm expecting the intelligence layer to speak back to me. That doesn't always need to happen in a world where like you can trust the intelligence layer more and more to do the job it needs to. OpenAI seems to be the company that is pushing the intelligence layer in that way. The UI still is I chat in, I get chat back, no execution or actions are taken. But in a world where that's not the case, and all of a sudden we're able to say like speak to a microphone or send a one-off command and walk away, that interface and whatever we look at as the app layer changes, still distribution, still brand that matters, because
Yeah.
ultimately
Yeah.
someone needs to choose something to input something somewhere. But right now it doesn't necessarily need to be like Perplexity, I read out information and I go to do something with it. It's all of a sudden like new company, I want something done, things happen.
I can imagine the commercial now. Hey man, you got that button?
Yeah.
You like, dude just hits a button and just asks for what he wants.
Yeah, you just got like you can do like if you want something really, really awfully branded, do like a Boy Scout sash with all the merit badges. You just like hit each one for a different job sort of thing. You can just be walking around with what jobs are spinning and you can have your own loading icons on your body.
Yeah, but I think this gets closer to Lexia, like what, like your dream of like not sitting behind a keyboard and not sitting behind a. Like, if you could just enable that for what already works. I mean, the strategy I would imagine the right strategy is take the thing that it already works today, which is coding. Like that's
Yeah.
the thing that like LLMs have shown they can actually do so far pretty well, and just enable that with different interface,
Yeah.
and then expand use cases after you can verify that that's like working pretty well.
Yeah. It's just right now I think we're seeing a lot of companies pop up and take like different slices of things. Even though I was in the gym the other day and there was a guy in the gym right there, like he had AirPods on and he was clearly like mind you, this guy is like gigantic. Like he was bench pressing 400 something pounds for reps. And
Wow.
between I think he just like went on mute. He went off mute after he finished his set and he was in a work meeting and just doing things like in the middle of the gym. And I'm trying to do that exact same thing. But unfortunately, I'm a nerd who has to write code. And I can't do that
That's
because
awesome.
I can't rock around with a laptop everywhere.
That's awesome.
And unfortunately, no company has done like a good enough job that I can just like speak into a machine and all of a sudden the code just works and it's deployed and it's perfect. Devin maybe go in there, but I haven't heard that everyone likes Cursor more because that's the workflow. But one day.
I do think to that point, just to emphasize, like we all take meetings on some version of mobile, in the car, on a walk, all kinds of things like that. And so you could envision a future, maybe in the not too distant future, where you are engaging with some version of AI agent who is accomplishing some task on your behalf through that interface, right? The interface of our Apple AirPods or something similar, just to try to put an idea. Okay, guys, I want to take a hard turn here as we finish out this week's episode. Shashi, I know you've got some ideas floating around, some things you want to discuss, maybe kick around on the progress maybe of Doge so far, this overall idea of as we look towards where value is going to be in the future, where does value come from? How does this interplay with government, et cetera? So why don't you kind of set the stage for us there?
I think there are two stories happening right now. I think there's one story happening in which people who feel threatened, particularly on the political left, are frustrated, annoyed, angry with people in the administration who are destroying Tesla supercharging stations, protesting, etc. So there's like that message. But like there's this other thing that's really important that feels like it's happening that is underreported. If you watch the All In Pod has interviews with Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent, and I think as two really important cabinet members, like what they're trying to achieve and how. And I think there's like this really important story of building American financial integrity that's happening. And I think it's underreported. And I think people don't really understand it we've been so conditioned to be emotionally reactive to the news of the day. And I think if we find a way to like just take all of these components in perspective and realize that if these projects work, we're going to be in such a great financial position that the US will be much stronger as a country in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. And yes, that comes with some changes to the way we spend money, but those should be really productive and helpful. We shouldn't be wasting money on, for example, Social Security recipients that are no longer alive, or contracts that the government issues for work that is not actually useful and productive for the American population. There's a lot of that exists, and of course it would exist because no one has cared about spending money, right? Every congressional body we have, every new Congress only looks to add spend. Nobody's going through all of that and saying, well, should we really be spending this thing that was approved in 1994 and we still happen to send out the checks? Nobody asks those questions, right? This is our like once in a lifetime chance to just get rid of a bunch of muck in the system, clean it out. This is like technical debt for a software company that has like never reviewed packets of code that have existed for like 40 years. Like, let's get rid of the COBOL, quite literally. Let's get rid of like the old nonsense that has existed in the system and start from a much stronger base. And this is after World War II, we took the best people in industry and brought them into government and empowered them to upgrade the systems of government. We haven't done that since until now. And the quality of business people and technology people that are going into government today is just really impressive. There's just such an incredibly impressive group of people in working in not just the Doge apparatus, but in government roles to help improve the country for free almost always. I think it's an underreported story, and I think the news media is missing the broader narrative.
So do you think, like, I guess, like, what do you think this big evolution and efficiency gain, which for the record, like, again, governments are ancient, like they use technology and HTML pages from like the 90s for a lot of like work, right? Like, where do you think, like, for example, like, do you think that ends up being a gigantic technological, I mean, okay, of course we're seeing like the people changes that's happening, but do you think there's a gigantic technological reformation that happens in government? And if so, how quickly?
A lot of old systems are being addressed right now and rewritten, improved. Old systems getting thrown away, accountability being placed into checks that get sent out from government.
Hmm.
The amount of waste in terms of our economy is staggering. Lutnick describes it as at least 25% and perhaps 50% just pure waste of spend that's low efficiency. And so the overall package, the overall idea is lower taxes, lower spending, more balanced budget, something closer to a balanced budget if we can't get there all the way, which improves the value of the US dollar, improves the career opportunities for working Americans, hopefully without moving the needle at all on Social Security. Social Security now is at 65 years old, and Lutnick's approach is let's keep it exactly there. Like let's not move it to 70. Let's give ordinary working Americans every benefit we can, and let's tax them less. One of the concepts on the table is no income tax if you're making $150,000 or less. And I think those are awesome proposals. Those are the kinds of ideas we need to have a robust middle class again. And the way we get there is just by being smarter with the money we spend. So I think there's like a really important story happening that is like it feels like it's just not being covered in the right way. And instead there's like this really like emotionally reactive story coming from the other side that it feels like it's missing context.
Yeah.
Let me
Good.
got a few comments here. Let me first agree with the overall goal as stated, meaning like if you do in some ways right size kind of the American economy, if you do get something back close to a balanced budget, like I think that the majority of reasonable people would agree that is a worthwhile goal. Let me also then follow that with my chief criticism of what kind of President Trump and Doge has been thus far, which is it's kind of wrecking ball strategy, whereas in government, I think you need to be more surgical and scalpel-like. So tabling both of those, let me also then say I think it's incredibly important that we distinguish obvious inefficiencies from ideological or potential inefficiencies. Excuse me, I'll unpack that a little bit kind of further. So I think what you said, Shashi, is completely correct in that obviously Social Security payments shouldn't be going out to people that are deceased or shouldn't otherwise be having Social Security. I think where the lines get more difficult and when kind of the line items of cut or don't cut become more gray, if you will, is on items that don't necessarily have a direct ROI benefit, but that may bring with it intrinsic benefit to the US. And I'm not really an expert in those places. Like I don't really know how to appropriately proportion those budget, but let's say as a hypothetical, the US government could invest $100. And rather than worrying about the return of $150 to that $100 invested, that bought soft power or that bought intrinsic value worth $200. Those events are more difficult to isolate in things like USAID or otherwise. I think there are obvious opportunities to cut kind of waste, fraud, and abuse as it's been outlined, but by cutting whole cloth, you end up cutting a lot of those intrinsic benefits that otherwise might be difficult to add back. And so, again, starting with the fact that I agree with the overall goal, I think if I have any criticism of what has happened so far, it's been on the implementation side. And I think to your overall point, where I have had pushback in this conversation and in previous ones to President Trump as a messenger, I think that's the problem. I think that fundamentally, even when you're doing something good in a politically charged environment, the message has to be delivered in a way that isn't ostracizing. And first, also, let me say the right Republicans, President Trump as a figurehead, are not the only ones kind of culpable for that messaging. I think both messaging has become far too polarized. And like, for example, Operation Warp Speed and the delivery of vaccinations during the pandemic should have been far more celebrated than what it was. And I think the reason you didn't see that celebration was because it was a Trump-led presidency. And so just kind of to recap, like I think the central goal is exactly as stated. I think the methodology that has been used is something that I would argue isn't the best method, although would be happy to be proven wrong. And finally, I think the accounting becomes hard and nebulous in certain areas, which is a further kind of, to your point, compounding nuance that is lost in this kind of whiplash, news cycle of we're sending money where we shouldn't be. We found a bunch of waste, fraud, abuse, and kind of otherwise.
Yeah, my take on it is like one, like I'm very like being objective in the sense that like a thing that spends too much money should spend less money. Perfect sense. You don't need any sort of degree to be able to say something like that, right? I agree with Damon in general that like to me the execution has felt a little bit chaotic, but that also comes with the effect that like we live in very, very politicized times where like society is quite partisan right now. And the weight of partisanship is quite heavy on either end. And there doesn't really seem to be like a lot of weight in what the center is. And I think like that kind of plays into like what the media cycle is, where it's like you are either aligned with what's happening or you're not aligned with what's happening. If you're not aligned, you should be pissed. If you are aligned, you should be pissed at the other people, And it creates like a pretty like unhealthy thing that like no one's really ever hearing good news or hearing the reason or ever really hearing like, hey, this is why you should care about this and what this does for our country. Because ultimately it's like us versus them narrative feeds the media cycle and what is a very, very partisan time right now. It's unfortunate, but it's not surprising, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just add that the media's incentive is to keep everyone inflamed because that's what keeps your eyeballs on screen more, right? And the biggest funding for media companies comes from pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies want to sell you more drugs and actually kind of helps them that you're stressed out. So, so you being like kind of a stressed out, you've got restless leg and diabetes and, every condition, like all of those things help the pharma companies that are trying to sell you their drugs, who are the primary backers of these media companies like CNN and MSNBC. So there's an incentive from where you're getting information from that keeps all of us in an inflamed state. But all of that is to say, like, if we agree that we need to spend less, then what is the threshold of correctness? So Damon, earlier you said this is sort of wrecking ball. I would say like there is some percentage of like some percentage of accuracy that is good enough for us to go forward, right? In terms of cuts. So, I would argue it doesn't need to be 99% accurate. It doesn't need to be 90% accurate. Like in my mind, it's something like 70%, like if you get 70% of those calls right of where to save money, that's good. That's a win. We should take that as a country because every dollar we spend that we have to borrow money for, we're paying interest on. And interest rates are high right now. The Fed funds rate is north of 4. So we're refinancing a lot of government debt and we're continually paying interest on that debt. And if the market doesn't want all of our debt, we have to continually pay higher and higher interest premiums above that threshold. We're paying a ton of money in interest alone, right? Every dollar we save means we not only save the principal, we save paying interest at that point. So it's really important for us to get this right. And I in my mind, it may appear a bit ham-fisted or wrecking ball, but actually I think like they're getting more right than wrong. And I think that's an important piece of context that as long as they're getting more right than wrong, we all as a population benefit.
Yeah,
I
let
think
me concede. Go ahead, Lakshya.
I was just gonna say, like, I think giving empathy to where it's due. I think a lot of folks, like, ultimately, like every single layoff is a person. We live in like what is a pretty challenging economic time. Like, and it's been a pretty challenging economic time where like people have jobs, people have been underemployed or unemployed for like quite a while. So I definitely like. I think it is important to take both sides of the conversation. Where like I think the economics and like when you look at it as metrics and numbers, it like all the actions make sense. I just wish that like what happened to Twitter clearly worked. Like, objectively, the way that Twitter and its like transition was executed worked. It was just done in a very intense, really, really challenging way. And the same thing's happening now, right? The same execution strategy is working. It's just like ultimately, like, I wish that there were ways to pull this off that were smoother for the people at the boots on the ground level. I mean, the government jobs don't even pay that much anyway, in a lot of cases at least, And these are like, there it's a lot of change, and change is what's causing us to actually be able to say like, yes, we're going to save a lot of money. Yes, like the US's position 5 years is going to change. It's just I think people are already quite scared. The media inflammation is really, really large. It's just like it's a bad formula, I think, for public sentiment in general.
But is there a way to do this in a way that's delicate? I'm not convinced that there's any like polite way of saying, you know what, we need to cut a lot of the spend, and sorry, but this is a bunch of freeloading that we've got to cut. How do you do that in a way
You
that's
hire a
like,
consultant, and that way you tell the employees that you paid $20,000 before choosing to lay them off, and that makes them feel better.
yeah.
2 points. Number one, I want to concede that you've properly stated the argument, Shashi, meaning like you're not going to get to 100% accuracy, nor are you ever going to be at zero. So what you're really debating is at what level of accuracy are we comfortable? Also, my sentiment is essentially exactly like Lakshya's in that from a purely dollars and cents perspective, and my brain thinks that way more than most, you're 100% correct. The challenge with this particular ledger is the other side of that argument is sometimes somebody's livelihood. And so that's where like saving a dollar, even if that dollar extrapolates to $3, given the interest payments over time, is $3 worth the societal impact of someone new being out of jobs. And again, back to my argument on intrinsic benefit, does that someone new out of job cost the overall system $4, even though he saved $3? That's where the accounting gets very challenging. And I'm not dreaming of having the answer to that. But to your point, Shashi, I don't know. And actually, I would kind of maybe make my own counter argument here slightly, in that where I will give ground is that while this isn't Twitter, meaning it's not a private company that if this doesn't work and it goes bust is okay because the world can live without Twitter, whereas maybe the world can't live without some version of the United States government. What I will say is to your most recent point is, can you do this in a way that is purely surgical? I would actually lean on the answer being no. So again, we're kind of back to our like gray area debate over where like how much accuracy is enough. And that's overall where I kind of sit on the jury still feels kind of out to me on exactly how this program shakes out. Like I just don't think that, we're what, 60 days or so into a new administration. I don't think that's enough time to purely judge success or failure of the overall endeavor. Where I will give the administration a compliment, and I think a well-deserved one, is it has seemed to me through my entire life, from my political conscience has been, give or take 15 years, what they're doing feels like political suicide in a way that I didn't think any administration would be able to or willing to take on. So I just want to give them credit for going after that. All of that said, I am skeptical based on my, somewhat naive understanding of where all the line items are in the federal budget that you can actually get to the cost saving measures necessary without touching the three big buckets. And that's going to come with some serious political shrapnel that I'm not sure this administration or any other one for that matter is going to walk into, primarily Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. Those are the three biggest buckets we spend on. I don't know how much can be reasonably saved if you're not going to tap into some of those three buckets, and we'll see. And then on the other side of that ledger, obviously, is the whole tariff discussion, which we haven't gotten into. But if you can increase either growth or revenue, can cut less. We haven't really seen effective ways to do either one of those, but I'd be eager to hear solutions on either of those two kind of polls.
There's going to be lots of cost savings from people who are getting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, who are fraudulent or non-alive. There are just so many of these instances where there is no accountability. And you have systems where accountability has not been built into those systems. Government jobs don't have like financial accountability incentives. There's no incentive to be great at that in government. And so we've accumulated all of these kind of bad practices on bad systems for a long time. And just by upgrading those, we're going to catch many instances without having to change the rules, right? Like what you're describing, Damon, is changing the rules for cost savings. And that's the opposite of what Lutnick said. He's taking the other position of no, the rules are great as they are. Let's help the people who are actually Americans who are alive get Social Security at 65. We don't have to pay people who are fraudulent get Social Security, or people who are not alive get Social Security. So there are lots of ways in which we're going to realize savings without having to change the rules fundamentally.
Yeah, I agree holistically with that. I think the place I'm skeptical, if I'm skeptical at all, is that I don't know that I believe that argument to be true. Meaning, I
Yeah.
don't know that you can get to the level of cost savings necessary to make significant headway on this challenge without changing the rules. And to be determined whether or not that is the case. Although, again, circling back and giving credit where it's due, in my opinion, this is a problem that needs to be at the forefront. It is now at the forefront, and kudos to the people that made that happen.
I guess this podcast has gone very long. This has been a lot of fun. But the question, I think, to spin a positive light on what is an interesting political time, a lot of our listeners are naturally builders that are naturally people who are in the tech and business space. Right now is a time of a lot of shifting tides, whether it's at the government level or it's at the tech level. If we look at this government conversation, what does the opportunity become, right? If so much is changing, what can you do as a business person or as a technical person that's suddenly new ground or a new thing to expose and try?
It's a good question. I think I would start at the simplest, which is so long as you continue to make something people want, there's always going to be a market for it, regardless of uncertainty, regardless of whether or not the markets will be shifting AI or otherwise underneath you. So long as you can point to real value for some end user, you're going to have a market. I think on the counter side of that, I think that companies who have historically relied on government funds for a large source of their revenue are on shakier ground than they were before. And so whether that be defense contractors. Maybe that's a bad example because maybe defense actually goes up. But the point I'm trying to make is if a bulk of revenue comes from government sources, I think that is a area of potential uncertainty for better or worse, meaning like, there's going to be some amount of budget cuts that happen that should be happening. And that's going to result in lower revenues for some companies.
If I had an AGI, Lakshya, and I could delegate kind of the creation of here's the algorithm I would tell it to follow. I'd say identify 20 high value products that are manufactured or created outside the United States in countries that are going to receive significant tariffs, right? Tariffs are not a new thing. In fact, India, for example, Howard Lutnick mentioned this, has 100% tariffs. There are many countries around the world who tariff us at very high rates today that we've been accepting.
Yeah.
So this is not a new thing. In fact, I believe the year is 1913. Before 1913, we didn't have an income tax. All of our money was made by tariffs. So this whole idea that like income tax is like the only way for a government to collect money and tariffs are this like really weird bad word, nobody else believes that. Like everybody else has tariffs on us. Let's have kind of a level head about this instead of reacting in a purely political lens. And so in this world where there are going to be more tariffs, when products are made in other countries, the algorithm I would tell the AGI to follow, should it exist, is find products, high value products made outside the United States that are likely to be in high tariff zones, create entities that make those products in the United States, make them efficiently, make them with technology first, right? And then make them with high quality American labor next.
Mhm.
And in doing so, you're going to create products that have cost advantages over those tariffed products made overseas, both because of the technology and because you aren't paying those tariffs. You're set up to produce those goods locally. And then I'd say find for each one of those products, find the 20 biggest customers of that product, reach out to them, start formulating partnerships to have American made products and services delivered to replace those foreign made ones. You will get support in this administration for that.
I
That's
agree
a
with all
quick
that.
$1 trillion.
Yeah, I do agree with all that for the record. I think the challenge that I have is imagining what those products would be when you factor in the cost of labor to produce said products and those being able to overcome the cost burden of the tariff. Like, I think the hypothetical
Tesla's a great example,
exists.
right? So like Tesla's exactly this. Tesla's 100% American made. It's good for the environment. It's an electric vehicle, right? It's primarily machined, right? The factory is the product. The
Mhm.
factories are tech, right? The tech
Mhm.
is the leading producer, but they also have tons of employees who are part of that kind of factory apparatus. That's the model. Like I would just say like the Tesla of whatever, like figure out all the whatevers.
Sure.
All right.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us for this week's episode of the Scholar AI Founders Pod. Reminder to like and subscribe and find us on our YouTube channel. See you all next week.